great you guys have formed it and are really doing a good job putting it together. And I don't know everybody else who has, but I'm glad you've done it. Environmental law 30 years ago, there weren't any jobs in the field. So everyone you see here is relatively new. In terms of the practice, 30 years ago, there just wasn't any environmental law to be practicing. And 10, 15 years ago, I suspect most of the environmental law that was done, you guys sort of think of it, the students think of in terms of out there in the country someplace. Denver has an institute. Vermont Law School has a master's degree. You can get away up on the internet and so on. But what I think has gotten fascinating to me, at least, is that the risk in the environment and the ways in which it is worked out. We used to think was sort of a scientific solution. The scientists now are quite willing to admit that they can identify some of the problems in the environment, but exactly what risk levels we're willing to tolerate has largely become a political solution, and that's one thing that lawyers are pretty good at. So, and it seems to me that the places that the environmental problems are the most acute are in the cities and urban areas. They're the most intractable, difficult problems to solve are here. And also, there's interesting political constituencies in each urban area that makes the problem solving really fascinating. You see all of the players in an urban setting. That's a little harder to find out in the hinterlands. In the Sierra Nevadas, it's hard to find anywhere. But nonetheless, so I'm glad you've started this society, and I hope you will continue, the interest continues, and that you guys will bring something that will help people study environmental issues in an urban setting, which is, I really think, we're the next sort of interesting subcontinent. So, but I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to listen to some folks who are actually in practice, and the first person I'd like you to hear from is Emil Slavik. And he is a section chief for the enforcement, affirmative enforcement at the New York State Attorney General's office, Environmental Protection Unit. He comes by here, I heard him saying 2,000 or 3,000 times last year, but has never been in our building before.
First
so,
time.
welcome. And
thank you. Thank you. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to stop in. I do live just up the hill, actually, and talk to you for a few minutes about environmental practice. As law students, I presume that it's fair to say that you're probably here tonight because you're interested in pursuing a personally and professionally rewarding career in an area of your interest, and you want a job, ultimately. And hopefully, what I'd like to share with you this evening is, I would say, probably three very basic things that I think can help you achieve that in the environmental area. And trying to think how you spin it out. In some ways, it sounds very elementary, very basic. But I think in law school, a lot of times when I think back, it wasn't so terribly long ago when I was there, and how it came to be that I ended up in environmental law, which I frankly don't think I heard of when I went into law school. I came to it from, gee, it's all about trees and birds and fishing and water. That sounds cool. I like all that stuff. It will help you steer through and make the best run at your chosen field, be it environmental law or, frankly, check it out and say, gee, it's too technical or too many acronyms, and I want to become a matrimonial lawyer and deal with throwing ashtrays and things. These things, I think, hopefully will help you with that. And I guess the way I'd start is to make probably a very obvious point, but law school is about becoming a lawyer. And before you really think about becoming an environmental lawyer, whatever that is exactly, I think probably the thing that is most important for you to do is concentrate on becoming a good lawyer. And obviously that's what do. There are facets of environmental law that, that you can give some specific thoughts to in that regard. It is very statute-driven, learning how to read statutes, how to make statutory arguments is a real skill and is really the stock and trade of the lunch of environmental practice. A fair amount of it has developed in the common law, but in this country, bread and butter environmental work, if you will, involves the application of statutes and regulations, interpreting what the heck they mean, trying to come up with a more plausible, better fitting interpretation argument than the other side. So, as you go through, that's kind of one thing to think about. The other point that I'd make of that, I think it's easy to focus too much on a specific subject matter early on. Taking environmental law courses, having general familiarity with the substance of the law and the kind of practice area, the kind of issues you deal with is very, very important to make sure it's really what you like to do and what makes sense for you as a lawyer. And people come to it from a lot of different ways. Sometimes, people are attracted to environmental law because they're, in fact, environmentalists, and they want to, make the environment better. That's a great goal, and if that's your goal, it may be that being an environmental lawyer is the best way to do that. Maybe it is not. So, don't necessarily think that that's the only way you can serve that interest, because ultimately you may decide you much prefer working with people, interpersonal issues, and all those things are there in environmental law. But day in and day out, it's not certainly what the field's known for, shall I say. So learning those basic lawyering skills, figuring out where your talents, your skills lie, and being exposed to a broad array of environmental issues, but working on those basic fundamentals, corporations. Every day, my job as an environmental enforcer, I'm always looking, how can a shell corporation that has no money, has no assets, and is made a big mess, how can I make the individuals pay? And basic principles of corporate law, nothing to do with the environment, nothing to do with what you might necessarily think is, environmentalist, like corporations, yuck. Critical subject for practicing environmental law from my day-to-day experience as someone out there enforcing our laws. Different things like that, basic business principles, basically things that make economic sense, that make practical common sense, tend to work the best, and if they comply with the law and figure out a way where those interests and the environmental interests can be met at the same time, generally works the best, works the quickest. It's not to say that can always be done, but understanding kind of the basic real-world dynamic that's out there is very, very useful. So those basic ways, in terms of getting that first environmental job or those other things, it really, when looking at a law student candidate looking for a job, we don't look for someone who knows backwards and forwards and knows what TMDL stands for. Those are all things that are not, in the scheme of things, that important for getting the basic skills to function very well as an environmental lawyer. So the real emphasis from the legal education, the legal skills side, in my view, should be focused on basic skills, basic courses, with enough of the environmental stuff to figure out that it's what you're really interested in, and certainly show to a prospective employer that it's actually, in fact, I have interest in environmental. There's probably a better way to do that, but I'll talk about last. Second thing, pretty basic, but also overlooked, I think, to a certain extent, is basic communication skills, not only in environmental law, every legal field, very critical, often overlooked in the education process, but really, really critical to be able to very quickly, all the better, but effectively and fairly simply communicate relatively complex ideas. Much jargon of environmental law is statutes, is more acronyms, a list of acronyms that we deal with on any given day. Bowl over the sturdiest of acronym writers. All of those things really become mumbo jumbo to a judge or a relevant decision maker if you can't really communicate the very core issue of what it's about. I mean, TMDL is a very important concept, but if you can't communicate that to a judge or to some developer who's like, what do you mean? You're just standing in the way of my wonderful project. Or to a citizen who's like, yeah, why aren't they complying with the law? What's this TMDL stuff? You have to be able to simply, directly, best you can, communicate pretty complex material. And we're looking at law students, lawyers starting out, and experienced lawyers. Those are the basic things that really, really are important. The acronyms, you list in a brief appendix as what the heck you're talking about, but that's but the basic communication is irreducible core to real power. And I guess the third thing that I think that could really help is really what you're doing here this evening, which is kind of outside the context of work, outside the context of course curriculum, but really what kind of shows to me as a prospective employer, somebody else as a prospective employer, is that you're really interested in the environmental field. And that is, to me, is shown much clearer, much sharper, much better by kind of pursuing activities that show that's really what you're about, so that's really where your interests are, than reference to professors, taking a list of courses about law or the substance of law. Not to say that's not important, but it's when you're in there talking to an employer, it gives you currency, it gives you some kind of real life experience to be able to really do two things. The second thing I talked about, which is communicate, is being able to talk to someone much better, much more effectively, much more directly about something you really did, in a case you thought was most important in environmental law, and it really helps show how you think, how you operate as a leader, and your basic value to anyone practicing environmental law. So I think you kind of, hopefully, think of those three things, as you go out there and work your way toward that field, or some other one if you decide this isn't one for you. Hopefully that will, help guide you, help focus your thinking, and help you go as far as you can.
Thank you. Our next speaker, I guess I ought to say there really are, we're used to having two sides, plaintiffs and defense, and plaintiffs lawyers and defense lawyers, but really, in environmental law, just to confuse things more, there really are three sides. There's the governmental interest, there's the interest of those who are regulated, and there's the interest of people who focus primarily on the environment. Michael Tone, our next speaker, is with Nixon Peabody. Have I got that right? Okay, and really, his primary focus is on the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. It's a more friendly term term, the CERCLA, or the Superfund, and the Clean Water Act, and the Resources Conservation Recovery Act. That has a more friendly name, RCRA, but for those of you that haven't bumped into those names yet, those are those areas, and those are the areas of Mr. Tone's current focus. Prior to the time, I guess, Michael, you had this interest, he was next door to us. Did you begin life as an ADA or an ADA over there in your legal life, perhaps? Is that right?
I began my legal life next door in the municipal building and over in 120 Skimmerhorn Street in Brooklyn Criminal Court, learning some of the communication skills that we just alluded to, learning how to deal with the bench and the bar and the defendants and the police, and we did that for 4 years, and learned one of the basic skills, or some of the basic skills that we just talked about, and that's how to take a case to court and try it to conclusion. Not everyone is made up to be a prosecutor. Not everyone is made up to be a criminal defense attorney. But one of the things both have in common is, especially at the beginning of your career, you learn how to take a case from the beginning through trial, how to pick a jury, and try it to conclusion. And that's a skill that's going to be invaluable later on. After I was a prosecutor for the Brooklyn DA's office, I then went into the Attorney General's office and was with the organized crime task force for a number of years. And then, so you're asking yourself, well, how do you get to environmental law? When one investigates and prosecutes organized crime, one inevitably finds your way to the solid waste or the garbage industry. And that piques your interest in environmental law. One of the attractive things about environmental law is the level of practice. I'd like to think that there's a higher level of practice than in many other areas of law, because number one, the people that you meet are generally very skilled at what they do, whether they're on the defense side or the regulatory side or the citizen side. They're very knowledgeable. The issues are important. They're important to your client if you're a private practice. They're important to the government attorneys. They're important to the citizens and citizen groups, because each of those entities have a stake in the outcome of the matter that's in your hands and that you're hoping to resolve. It's a lot of fun. Most of the time, it's a lot of fun. There are moments. The issues are challenging. You have a combination of some esoteric areas of the law combined with the scientific principles, combined with the political and public interest, all coming to a point that needs some sort of resolution. You meet a good group of individuals. They're generally, I've found environmental practitioners are practitioners that you enjoy practicing law with. And that's important, because you spend your life, if you remain in the profession, doing the same thing, and if you can do it with people that you like, that's a real benefit. And there's a variety of opportunities. In private practice, it's especially true that what you're doing today, you will not be doing 5 years from now. The state of the law changes. The issues change. The cases that you're handling today get resolved one way or the other, and you move on to something else. So you're constantly learning. And if you bring to the matter and bring to your practice a healthy curiosity and a willingness to jump in and get into a new area, it's really a challenging way to go through your profession, career. A couple of stories, and I think sometimes it's useful to hear experiences. I was a prosecutor, and I was prosecuting members of certain groups who predominated their activities in Brooklyn. And I ran into a fellow who's now my partner in another office, and he was with the DPC. And the state had just passed, in 1979, the state equivalent to the Superfund law, CERCLA. It was called the Hazardous Waste Disposal Site law. And I was invited to start a DEC office that would enforce that law. Well, the legislature passed it. They partially funded it. And those of us who began with this program got in a room on a November morning, and we looked at each other and said, what do we do now? How do you take a piece of legislation, interpret it, breathe life into it from a regulatory perspective, from an enforcement perspective, and make it work? And if you take that idea of pushing things to the edge, applying what you know and have learned in other areas of practice to a new area of practice or a new interpretation, it can be a lot of fun and it can be very challenging. Let me go to a less upbeat side of the house here. The area of environmental law, in my view, has matured. That's because the practitioners who started have matured, but many of them are still practicing. The subject has matured in that the regulated community no longer runs for their lawyer the first time they deal with an environmental issue. Frequently now, a regulated entity will have an environmental health and safety specialist who will be better review the lawyer interpreting their particular set of regulations that they deal with. So now only the issues that are novel, that are significant, tend to bubble up to the legal side. The routine gets handled as it should be at a routine level. That wasn't always the case. The types of cases have changed. CERCLA, Federal Superfund, has had a great deal of legislative experience interpreting that statute. There are still a number of cases that are pending out there in all the circuits, but those cases and the decisions related to those issues have, in many respects, been settled. There are new issues being raised all the time, but the initial issues of liability and allocation, they have, for the most part, been settled, and now the courts are interpreting around the margins. And the emphasis has tended to shift. You get less litigation, for example, on CERCLA issues. And now, as far as litigation is concerned, there are more issues or more cases related to environmental exposure and environmental risk and environmental toxic tort that arises from an environmental condition, and less having to do with regulatory enforcement or Clean Water Act enforcement. And that is one of the growing areas. I don't know how sustainable that will be in the longer term. One other change is in the corporate or transactional side. How issues and risk gets allocated when you buy and sell a company or buy and sell a parcel. The techniques for dealing with that have been, I don't want to say routinized, but they have been, there's some precedent in how to deal with that. So a attorneys handling transactions have an approach that you can bring to the table. Where the issues in dealing with those types of transactions are starting to bubble up are in the adequacy where the risk allocation is taking place. What I mean by that is environmental attorneys are now, or transactional attorneys are now facing some malpractice exposure for the way they have counseled their clients in allocating environmental risk in the purchase of or sale of businesses or the purchase and sale of property. So there's a higher, I think there's a higher level of risk, and there's a standard of care that has to be brought to transactions that maybe wasn't there 10 or so years ago, because everybody was learning as they go. So there's another new area that you have to be aware of. Then there are the standard regulatory enforcement, regulatory compliance, land use issues that are your bread and butter. But the combination of practice, the transition of a practice over time is varied, it's interesting, and it's encouraging. But again, the field is maturing. The practitioners that have been in it for a while are not retiring quite yet. The availability of for new attorneys coming into the field is narrowing. It's more competitive. A hiring partner at a firm will look at an attorney, a prospective associate, for their skills across the board, their ability to draft, their ability to write, their ability to communicate, their basic knowledge of the law and transactions, real property, and litigation, evidence that are the bread and butter of the law school. So I would encourage you to keep your interest. I'd encourage you to associate with those who are in the area of practice. I would encourage you to do as well as you possibly can in school, because that's where the first cut of the practice starts.
If I could interject just for a minute, I apologize. I'd really like to stay to the end and give the questions. It's really good, but I will confess I have infant baby girl twins at home, and I've got to leave my wife. I'm going to leave with Professor Johnson. My card has my telephone number and my email. If you have any questions or would like to go over anything, feel free to contact me. Thanks.
Well, our next speaker is John Byrne, and John is Professor John Byrne, I guess I should say. John graduated from Fordham Law School and also has an LLM from Pace Law School in environmental law. He's really been in environment with the DEC for, I guess, most of your career.
Yes, that's correct.
And he currently handles air and RCRA enforcement in Regional 2 office in Long Island City, Queens. He also is a student coordinator for the Region 2 office and is an adjunct professor at Fordham and also at St. John's, right?
That's correct. Thank you for having us all, first of all. I work out of the Region 2 office in Long Island City, Queens. I've worked in my career in 2 other offices, one in Tarrytown doing Superfund, and then before that Region 1, which covers Nassau and Suffolk County. We have 9 regions statewide and 3 field unit offices, of which Mike came from one of them. And it's always good to see people who are at the DEC go on, and Mike and I and other attorneys who used to be with the DEC now, we negotiate consent orders and things like that. We do use interns quite extensively at our DEC office in Long Island City, Queens. In fact, 3 of the people sitting around here right now are interns currently working in my office. So if any of you are interested in coming to the DEC and getting some environmental experience, it's a good place to do that. We hire people throughout the year, fall semester, the spring semester, during the summer. It is somewhat harder to get into the DEC during the summer because it's very competitive, because you have a lot of out-of-town law students who want to come back home for the summer and get some work experience in, an area of law. Coming over here, I said, well, what am I going to talk about tonight? And I said, if I were sitting on your side of the table, what would I want to hear from the speakers? And Dave Letterman has his 10 points, as you know. So I jotted down, I actually came out with 11 things. And some of those, what I'm going to say, which I'll go through very quickly, were already said by Lem or by Mike. And everything both those gentlemen said, I totally agree with. Number one on my list, you should take environmental courses in law school. You have Professor Johnson here who teaches environmental law. I don't know what courses, but whatever he teaches, whoever else you have teaching here, take those courses. If you're really interested in this field, take those courses and do as well as you can in those courses. Number two, there are environmentally related courses in law school. Land use is one, real property is another. Take those courses. Wouldn't hurt to take an administrative law course either if you're ever going to work for a government agency. Number three, as I just mentioned, do internships or externships, and I've never quite figured out what the difference in those two words is. DEC hires interns, EPA, law firms, corporations. I was a night student when I went to Fordham, and I had a full-time job, so I couldn't take advantage of that, and I think that's something I really missed. So I would urge you, especially those of you who are day students, to take as many of these internships as you can in different areas, and if you're really interested in environmental, work for the DEC one semester, work for the EPA another semester, work for a law firm, third semester, work for a public interest firm a fourth semester, and see all the different ends of the spectrum on how environmental law is handled. Number four, I have here join environmental organizations. You have an organization here you're starting up. Join the Sierra Club, join NRDC, join these different organizations, find out what they're about, what their missions are, what they do. This next point is sort of a spin-off of my first point. There are other law schools in the area that, if you're interested in a certain area of environmental law and they don't teach it here, take a course somewhere else. When I went to Fordham, I took a course at NYU in food and drug law because that was something that interested me. So go to an NYU or a Columbia or a Fordham or a St. John's, and if they have a course that's not being taught you, well, if you can get it taught you, that would be the best thing. But if you can't, take it to some of these other places, and the schools are pretty good most of the time about reciprocating credit and grades and stuff like that. Number six, I wrote this 3 times, network, network, network. If you read any book on job hunting, headhunters, all that stuff, they will tell you network. And when you talk to somebody, if they can't help you, ask them if they know somebody else who can help you. And it's an expanding universe. You talk to one person may lead you to 2 may lead to 5 may lead to 10, and eventually you'll hit something. So you got to network, you got to talk to people. Another thing, and I'm not an active member of this, but I would recommend you join the New York State Bar Association. They have a student membership which is very cheap. They have a lot of activities. They have a lot of conferences. It's a good place to meet people. It's a good place to learn what's currently going on in environmental law. So I would urge you all to join the New York State Bar Association. Hand in hand with that, number 8 on my list is keep abreast of current environmental issues. What's going on in the Hudson River right now? Know what's going on. Try and read articles that have different viewpoints, because someday you may be in an interview with somebody who's involved in one of these current issues. And if you can talk intelligently about it, gets back to what Mike said, being able to intelligently talk and write and things like that, you're going to be ahead of the game over somebody else who's interviewing for that same job who can't talk about it because they don't know about it. Another thing is, I'm a New Yorker. I was born in Manhattan, raised in Queens. My father went to Brooklyn Law, so I do have an affinity for Brooklyn Law School. In fact, he used to tell me, I don't know if you know this, Brooklyn Law School many, many years ago, in his era, was part of St. Lawrence University. He used to always tell me that when I was in my 20s, and I never understood why. But,
So grand degrees.
yes, yes. He had, back then he got an LLB, I guess it was, not a JD, right? But what I'm trying to say here is there may be a lot of opportunities in the environmental law field outside of this area. Some people are married to New York. They think the world ends at the 59th Street Bridge. It doesn't. I live in Queens on the other side. Or I live in Nassau, east of Queens. Look in other places for opportunities. I lived in Texas for 7 years. They could use a lot of help down there, believe me. Lived in Houston, in fact, and I think that might be replacing LA as the salon capital of the world, right, Mike? And then, no matter what you do, this is now a general recommendation. I think the best place to start when you're getting out of law school, and doing these externships or internships also, is getting litigation experience. Because every lawyer is an advocate. And I don't care if you got a job doing deals or getting consent orders signed or stuff like that. At some point, you're going to have to go in a hearing or a court or somewhere and get up and argue. And that's what we lawyers do. We are taught to argue. You know, what's the plaintiff say? What's the defendant say? What's the court say? You really have to have that at a very, and Mike got into this a little, at a very early stage in your career. Then if you decide, well, litigation is not for me, all right, fine, you can branch off and do something else. But I would say early in your law school and post-law school career, try and get a position where you're in a courtroom, where you're litigating, where you're writing legal papers. I think that's really the key stuff. And then again, if you want to branch off, you can branch off. And finally, this is my last point, try and get something published while you're in law school. Because you go talk to a Mike Tone or somebody like that, you want to work in a law firm, people are a lot more impressed with something that's been published somewhere, I don't care if it's a magazine, a trade journal, a law review, than for somebody to hand in their first year, first semester, second semester moot court brief. So try and get something published. If there's no place here at Brooklyn Law School to publish, try and go elsewhere. There are plenty of journals out there. Pick a topic you're interested in, do a note, do an update, whatever. But you want to have something to walk into an interview and show the interviewer, this is a published article. And I guess that's all I have to say. I don't want to monopolize this. There are other speakers. If anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, or we have questions and answers at the end.
At the end, we're certainly.
Again, if anybody wants to work at the DEC, come see me. Set you up. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Professor Steve Barshoff. It's a little hard for me to introduce Steve. Nonetheless, currently he's of counsel with Sive, Leger, and Rizel, which is a firm in New York City that focuses on environmental problems from the environmental point of view. If those of you who are interested in the environment may have heard the name David Sive before, quite some personal sacrifice. He's sought to represent environmental groups. He's written extensively in the environmental law area, and Steve's with that firm. The other thing about Steve, he was my student some years back. I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was. And that's really not gray in his beard. It's all funny. He just wants to look a little older than he really is. And so, Steve, it's really nice to have you back and speaking to a group of environmental students. The other thing I guess I have to tell you about Steve is he has a joint degree from this school and also another school of planning. And I can remember when Steve used to run bus tours through New York City. Okay, Steve.
Well, thank you very much. I'll give you a little bit of my background, which is somewhat unusual. Went to Colgate. I was graduated in Colgate back in the 70s. We'll let the rest of it go from there. Came to Brooklyn Law School, and I was a full-time student initially in Brooklyn Law School. I will tell you this, and I don't tell this to too many people, but I want you to really understand that anybody can go anywhere. I was rejected at every single law school that I applied to, including Brooklyn. I was rejected because I was basically a screw-up the first 2 years that I was at Colgate University, and I almost flunked out. I did very well in the LSAT, however. I traded a bicycle for private lessons from a guy who went to Harvard and developed his own program on how to take the LSAT. And I was, I think, his star pupil. Nevertheless, I still got rejected at every law school I applied to. However, about a week and a half before the semester began, I got a telephone call from Brooklyn saying that they had reconsidered my application and did I want to come to law school, and if so, I'd have to start a week and a half. I asked them if I could postpone my admissions. They already was in law school training as negotiation was starting. They told me I could if I was deathly ill or entered the active military service. Needless to say, I was in law school 10 days later. After being a full-time student my first semester, I realized that this was insanity, at least from my point of view. And so I went into the night school. And then I was back to being a full-time student the next year as I started to pursue the joint degree program, but stayed in law school as a night student. So it took me 5 years to go through school. Not 4 as a night student, but 5 years for joint degree and going to school part-time. And what I was doing during the day was giving educational seminars on the history and development of New York City. I took about 10,000 people through New York, Chase Manhattan Bank, Bankers Trust, groups in the Soviet Union. This was done with Don Sullivan, making rest in peace, who was someone who was head of the, along with Peter Salins, were people that were running the Urban Affairs program at Hunter. Because I had this substantive background in local government, and by the way, I learned more local government law taking courses at Hunter, and learned more about land use in a substantive setting, not a legal setting, but in a substantive setting at Hunter. That put me in good stead when I went out into the job market. But my job search was not in New York, as I was saying to others earlier. I was married at the time, and my wife had no desire to continue living in New York City. So I took the bar in New York, and we had decided to up and move to New Mexico. And so, as opposed to Texas, we were in Santa Fe. And I lived in Santa Fe for 8 years in the 1980s. I was very fortunate in that my first job out of law school was for the New Mexico Municipal League, which is the Association of the Municipalities in New Mexico. So I was in essence doing government work, but I was working for a not-for-profit. I wasn't actually employed by a city, but by almost like a trade association of cities, if you will. The benefit of that was I was very fortunate in that the creme de la creme of the legal work involving local government in New Mexico crossed my desk. When the local attorneys or the city attorneys couldn't figure out a problem, or there was weird litigation, or there was stuff on a statewide level that needed to be addressed, it tended to come across my desk. And I did legislative drafting, lobbying, litigation, training. I did a lot of training of local government officials, and my land use and environmental work grew out of that. So really, first and foremost, I'm a local government lawyer more than anything else. To let you know that you never know what will happen when you walk out the door from law school, my very first case was a constitutional free speech land use case before the New Mexico Supreme Court that had already gone through the legal system. And I was asked by the attorneys in Albuquerque, who was the party, we came in as amicus curiae, the municipal league, but they asked me to argue the case because none of those city attorneys in Albuquerque knew much about zoning. And at least I had had some law school and other experience academically. I didn't know enough to be scared. My main reaction was, thank God no one's asking me about trial procedure. This is just like moot court. I can do this. And so I was there answering questions before the 5 justices of the New Mexico Supreme Court. And what I realized in this time practicing in New Mexico is that the greater breadth that you have in your experience in law school, that is taking all of the basic courses. Those of you who have had my classes have heard this lecture before. so I'm going to give it rather short tonight. I agree that you should be taking courses to show your interest in environmental law, but I echo what Lem said in particular. You've got to be able to walk out the door with as broad a set of appreciation for various areas of law as possible, because you don't know what you want to do. You really don't. You don't know what job you're going to get. You don't know what you're going to be involved in, and every single area of the law interrelates with every other area of the law. There's just nothing that I've found that doesn't apply. My example that I give is I didn't know there was going to be a liability insurance crisis when I was practicing law in New Mexico. I didn't know that the municipal league was going to be setting up a self-insurance pool, and I was going to be the one that was going to be responsible for giving legal opinions on this. I didn't even take insurance in law school. All right, I did a lot of learning very quickly, and that's what was involved. In 1988, I came back to New York. I had been attorney for the New Mexico Municipal League. I had been in private practice as a named partner in a firm that I started with some other lawyers. That was a terrible mistake. My biggest lesson that I learned from there is be very careful when you go into partnership with. Judge them as people, not necessarily put anything else before that. I did not, and I regretted that decision. It was the only professional decision I've ever regretted. But I learned. I was then I left that firm, even though I started it, and I was in private practice for myself. Came back to New York in 1988. Again, the person to whom I was married was now tired of living in New Mexico, and so we came back to New York. And at that point, I continued in private practice, but after a couple of years, I became of counsel to Saif Patrick Rizal. They wanted to hire me as an associate, but we couldn't agree on money, and so I ended up becoming of counsel to the firm, which was a very wise move on my part. I have actually never been an associate at any law firm, which is just sort of odd. I've either been in-house counsel, or I've been a partner or of counsel. So anyway, Saif Patrick Rizal is the oldest environmental law firm in the United States. David Saif is truly one of the founding fathers of environmental law. Sadly, David has slowed down in recent years. He's not really doing as much. And the practice, I quite agree, the practice has matured. The areas of the law, the issues that are coming up, it has the feeling of a mature area of the law. In my work, I have been not only of counsel to Saif Patrick Rizal, but I'm also of counsel to another firm, Stadner & Balkin, which does a lot of tax incentive and real estate work. And my work with both of these firms, although now I'm a member at Saif Patrick Rizal, is primarily in the land use area. So my aspects of environmental law are not as much oriented toward enforcement, although I do have a few funny enforcement stories to tell you. Mostly in the area of environmental law involving environmental impact statements and the areas of environmental law that relate to development. I have represented and continue to represent all three legs, if you will, just as George was saying, all three sides of the triangle, if you will: land developers, opposition, and the government. And what we do, and it's one of the issues that I was asked to address tonight, is how do you balance these things out? This is very difficult, because if you come in one day to the same agency and you advocate a position for the developer, and then you turn around 2 weeks later and advocate the exact opposite position for an opposition group, your credibility can be compromised, and it can be difficult. Our firm will only represent developers inside New York City. We do not do any opposition work in New York at all, and that is a decision that was made quite some time ago. We will do opposition work outside New York City, and we will also represent governmental entities outside New York City. And there it depends on the issue of the matter, obviously, looking to avoid conflicts of interest. In terms of the types of work that I do, it's been quite clear to me that there has been nothing that I haven't done that hasn't helped me. Every single area, and I've practiced, when I was in private practice and I had left the firm that I had started, one of the things that I did, and if you're ever in this position, you'll know what this is like. there wasn't a person who walked in that door whose case I wasn't going to take if the claim was in any way legitimate. I did workers' compensation, I did personal injury cases, I did real estate closings, I did business, I did a little bit of estates. I wouldn't do matrimonial, I wasn't into throwing ashtray cases. I wouldn't do tax work, I didn't feel I was competent to do it. But by and large, I pretty much took whatever was going to come in the door because I didn't know if I was going to be able to survive as a sole practitioner. Bottom line was, I still do that. I marvel at Stadmar Balkan, where there are primarily transactional lawyers. Many of them, if I asked them to go into court to get an adjournment on a vote, they would run, freaking out into the night. This was unbelievable. Bottom line is that everything helps you be a good lawyer. Everything across the board. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. And litigation, to me, is the bottom line. Whether you litigate or not as a career move, you can choose not to litigate at the end of the day. But if you don't have some litigation experience, this is my belief, you don't think as sharp as a lawyer. If you've got to go in and test what you evaluate a case to be, or a problem to be, or a negotiation to be, if you have to go into court and defend what your evaluations are, your thinking will sharpen. I can't tell you how many times I have gotten transactional documents from very, very bright lawyers who have turned around and said to me, well, this is just the way that we do it. And I say to them, that may be the way that you do it, but that's not the way that the courts interpret it. And that's not the way that your client is going to be able to win. So I strongly encourage you, and I echo what you're saying. It doesn't matter if you're in the DA's office, doesn't matter if you're in legal aid, doesn't matter if you start out doing PI work, or whatever it is that you're going to do. To get some litigation experience is extremely, extremely important. In terms of what you can do as a law student, my suggestion to you, in addition to the things that you've heard today, is some type of substantive knowledge would be helpful. It really helped me. I did not have the greatest grades coming out of law school. Here's my paradigm, and it's cruel, but it's the truth. Brooklyn Law School is not Columbia University. Okay? So, if you graduate and you got great grades, you'll be fine. You'll be able to compete with the Columbias and so forth. If you don't have the greatest grades, then you have to do something else to substitute for. If you don't have another degree, you have to have some kind of substantive knowledge that you can demonstrate. Not law school knowledge, but substantive knowledge. If you don't have substantive knowledge, I agree. You've got to publish, and it's easy to publish. Trade associations, they'll beg you for articles. And they don't have to be very long, because you see, on your resume, when you list out 10 little 5-page articles that you've published, it looks impressive. They don't have to be all law review articles, okay? But the more that you can do to differentiate yourself from the run-of-the-mill candidate that is out there, the better off you are, okay? Also, and this sounds very basic, but I'm telling you, it distresses me. Do you have any idea do you know what the one writing sample is that everybody generates? Everybody generates it. It's the cover letter for your resume, okay? How many times do you think I get cover letters with typos in, blatant typos? More than half the time, I swear to God, okay? Get somebody else to look at your cover letter, because when you've written it 6 times, you won't see it anymore. You'll think you see it, but you don't. Somebody gave me a little test and said, how many F's, the letter F, do you see in this little 3 sentences? And I looked at it and I said 3. I had overlooked the F in of 3 times. Okay? Your eye just doesn't focus on it. Get somebody else, get your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your wife, your cousin, your father, whoever, get them to look at your cover letter. There's nothing that turns an employer off more than a cover letter that's got typos.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, what's the
resume.
Your resume. I'm going along with that. Absolutely. That's right. You can take it and apply to the resume too, without it. All right. Last couple of thoughts. A couple of ideas. Well, not, a couple of examples of kinds of work that we do in the office. Our work ranges from, at least in terms of the kinds of things I do. Dan Rosell, my partner, does a lot of the environmental enforcement work, so it's more shirt top. dealing with Region 2 all the time. My work is more developer or project oriented. Some of the projects that we're working on for the developers include a project for the Related Companies, which is one of the largest developers in the country. This is a 1,300 unit residential subdivision with 500,000 square feet of commercial, probably the largest proposed residential subdivision in the lower part of upstate New York. This has been a process. We are not the first attorneys, although we will be the last. This project has been, in one form or another, been going through the development review process for 10 years. We are now at the final supplemental environmental impact statement. Okay, so it's been quite a saga. We represent institutions as well. We represent New York Hospital in the program to redevelop the Westchester campus. They have probably the most pristine inner city piece of property in Westchester that the people of White Plains have coveted as a park for a long time. But the hospital has private property, and the hospital actually is exempt. Amazing scenario. Since the 1920s, it's exempt from condemnation by virtue of certain special laws that were enacted particularly for the hospital. The tension between the need for the hospital to expand its medical mission and the city councilors responding to political pressure to not want the hospital developed and preserve this land as open space has been a very interesting challenge. We represent up in Rockland County the Torrent Valley Preservation Association opposing a power plant that is proposed to be located in Rockland County. That involves administrative hearings before an agency called the Siting Board in New York State. I have various private clients in New York. I will tell you, give you perhaps one example of how you never know how enforcement is going to occur. This perhaps is a good way to end because it's kind of twists some things a little bit. We represented the U.S. Gypsum Company. U.S. Gypsum is a major plant along the Hudson River. And they've had disputes with their neighbors on and off over the years. One of them in particular really wants U.S. Gypsum to buy him out at top dollar. Well, there was a pipe that was literally an underground drain pipe that broke. And so U.S. Gypsum had to repair the pipe. So they excavated the land, and they had a pile of earth, maybe about this high and about this wide. And it was just sitting there, literally been excavated by a little backhoe just sitting there. And it rained. And when it rained, a rivulet, now I mean about this wide, ran down the side of this mound of earth and went across into a little ditch and wound its way down to a little tiny drain. It was about this big onto this guy's property. And about this much soil gathered at the bottom. Well, that soil, because it was partly land that was surface, had some gypsum in it. This is a gypsum plant. There is gypsum around. That drain, of course, if you hooked it into, well, it led into another drain, which went about 400 yards all the way into the Hudson River. So he called DEC, and the DEC enforcement officer came out and wrote a citation, which was enforceable in the town court. This is the town of Stony Point. Was in the town court for contamination of the waterways of the United States. And Dan asked me to go up and take care of this case. So I went up, and we were there in court, and of course the officer is there. And I say, look, you know, to get rid of this thing, we'll pay a civil penalty, but nothing criminal. And he goes and he talks to his people. No, they can't agree to that. I said, okay, we'll go try this game. So about a half hour later, he comes back to me and goes, you've got to do something for me. I go, well, what do you want me to do? He goes, what's your problem? So he says to me, look, I'm moving out of state. My wife is going to kill me if I've got to come back and testify for this thing, because we're going to get it adjourned that night. We're going to have a trial date set, you know. And he said, hey, this is the only thing he should kill me. I said, listen, what do you want to do? I'm sorry. You got to just go talk to your boss. That case was dismissed the criminal was dismissed. We paid a civil penalty because of nothing to do with the law, but because I stood firm and ended up telling him that he was going to have to come back, and he wanted to come back less because of what he was going on with his wife. Now, all I can tell you is that to feel out the process, to know what your adversary is, in every case, if there's two parties, there's 4 sets of karma at work. Your karma as a lawyer, your opponent's karma as a lawyer, and each party's karma is there. So in this particular case, whatever it was that was going on with him in his life was how this case got resolved. And my point to you is that the practice of law is not just about the books, the law, the principles. There are people that go through this process with their own problems and so on and so forth. I will be getting fees for showing up to a deposition which another attorney didn't cancel, which I would never normally ask for, but because this guy wouldn't adjourn a hearing for me when I had something very personal that was very important going on, because he was going to give me a hard time. As the judge said, what goes around comes around. These are the kinds of practical lessons that you will learn if you're an intern, if you're out there actually doing this stuff. And this level is equally as important as it is whatever it is that you're doing. All right? That's much.
Guys, this is your turn to ask questions. I'm going to reintroduce Michael, Tom Byrne, and Steve Barshoff, our experts. If you have questions, do you have questions?
I'd like to make one point. The most important courses you can take, corporations, tax, UCC, the property, future interest, trial practice, nothing against environmental law. But those are the basic, those courses are the courses that will teach you the statutory interpretation, regulatory interpretation, the transactions that make the world go around and that go wrong,